Thanks, everyone. Before you start, I just want to say two things. Number one is that I am terrible at Pecha Kucha format, so I'm gonna read the whole time. If you find this distracting, feel free to close your eyes and pretend you're listening to a TED Talk in a blackout. It'll be just the same. And then the second thing, on a more serious note, in addition to the territorial acknowledgement that we're on unceded territory, I also want to make a positionality acknowledgement, and just to say that I am clearly a large white male, and yet I work with primarily African Americans in New Orleans, and so I just want to say that whatever I say today is mostly my interpretation of the data and findings, and I, by no means speak on behalf of them, the community partners and whatnot. I'm really speaking on behalf of myself. So hit it. Okay. All right. My name is Jeremy Stone. I'm a PhD candidate in urban planning at UBC. My research looks at the intersection of gentrification and disaster, both by framing gentrification as a disaster that threatens low-income communities, but also as a product of disaster and our failure to plan for socially just disaster recoveries. Our theme today is social justice, and as an activist, to me, this has meant challenging or smashing the state. But as a public scholar, I realize that the public good is usually best served when existing systems are used or enhanced. So an essential tension in my work has been balancing being good and being smashy. The way I've addressed this is by taking a constituent-based approach, and yeah, that's me. Focusing my outcomes on what my partners in the community have articulated they might want or need. However, there's an ethical murkiness here if my dissertation is the center of that same project. So to be socially just, I've had to develop a socially just research design that is led by the community. So my talk today will focus on the evolution of my research, how it has been developed with and is responsive to the community I work in, and how I'm connecting it to larger scales of action, or how we're connecting it to larger scales of action. My research itself takes place in the central city neighborhood of New Orleans, which is historically African American and has faced a variety of economic and social challenges. During Hurricane Katrina, the neighborhood actually only got minimal flood damage, but many properties were abandoned by evacuees who could not afford to return. These properties in turn were seized by the New Orleans Redevelopment Authority and have slowly been returned to commerce through auctions to the highest bidder. This has contributed to gentrification in three ways. One is that the higher ground and central location is considered safer by new residents, so there are increasing demand pressures on the real estate market. Another is that the lack of a plan by NORA, the Redevelopment Authority, to protect neighborhoods for traditional residents have left them vulnerable to demographic change. And finally, the process of auctioning itself has actually buoyed housing values, which has driven up rents and property taxes. In addition to the loss of housing, the neighborhood has experienced considerable retail and cultural gentrification. Low-income serving businesses have been replaced by high-end restaurants, and the bars and social spaces that supported cultural institutions like Mardi Gras Indians and second-line bands are being lost. So how have I tried to develop a socially just research design? The first thing I did was pound the pavement in the neighborhood and visit every nonprofit or community organization saying, hey, there seems to be a problem with gentrification here. How can I offer my services as a pro bono consultant? Eventually, Harmony Neighborhood Development, a local public housing provider, took me on and asked me to do a qualitative study of how gentrification is impacting residents. They then introduced me to Kedra, a community liaison who works deep in the community and knows everyone. She and I worked out a plan which included working on the questions and issues she wanted to learn about as well. In the meantime, we visited city government officials and housing advocates to find out what kind of data would be useful for them in developing policies and action. We then performed 60 interviews with a range of stakeholders, including traditional residents, new gentrifying residents, business owners, nonprofit staff, culture bearers, city staff, and others. Some of these people we reached out to specifically, while others we met on the street or were referred to by others. Although we have far too many findings to discuss here, a few key ones are worth mentioning. The first is that traditional residents don't always see or understand gentrification. New Orleanians see their neighborhoods as the very blocks that they live on, and they don't always feel concerned if changes are happening 2 or 3 blocks away. Similarly, many changes are seen as inevitable and something that residents are powerless to stop. So we've come to find that educating the community on gentrification is critical. The second is that really the leading edge of gentrification is prison, with thousands of young men and their incomes being sucked out of the neighborhood every year. If we're going to be serious about curbing gentrification, we have to focus more on criminal justice reform and reentry programming that keeps communities whole. Third, we have to take back control of the market somehow. There are various schemes including cash for houses, Airbnb whole house rentals, quiet title evictions, manipulation of Section 8 laws, and others that enable the ongoing dispossession of housing from low-income African American residents. This requires a mix of policy interventions and education to preserve housing. Finally, almost all of our respondents have decried the loss of cultural and economic opportunities due to gentrification. Primarily white, middle-class in-movers refuse to participate in neighborhood events and rituals. They call the police on parades, musicians, and street vendors, and they treat older cultural spaces as blight and try to get them shut down. Clearly, there needs to be better understanding and support. So returning to our constituency model, what are we doing with all this data? The first is community organizing. We're working with Harmony and other partners to hold community meetings and rallies to educate the community about gentrification while empowering them as a voting bloc. We're also disseminating the data to area nonprofits to use in advocacy and fundraising. The second thing is engaging institutions. Rather than releasing a final study through Harmony itself, we're instead giving the study to one of the local foundations to release as their own publication. They're much more powerful than us, they can command media attention, and they can invest in policy programming on the back end. This is a strategic move to amplify our impact. As a part of this, we're also working with the city's Alliance of Housing Providers as a co-sponsor so that our study supports their recommendations for affordable housing. This is critical because we intend to release the study during the final 3 months of this year's mayoral and city council elections. Between the Foundation and the Housing Alliance, we intend to make this a policy issue that candidates have to respond to. Only after all of these actions have been taken will the dissertation become relevant or meaningful. At that point, I can wax lyrical about recovery justice and how gentrification threatens the daily life processes of low-income communities. Getting published in journals and books will advance that cause, and it is important. But it's really a secondary concern behind our work in Central City. So how do we advance social justice as scholars? I think we have to put people at the center of our work. I have what I call my brain trust, a group of people who are engaged, committed, and can guide me where the work should go. They define what the public good actually is, but they also use my skills and expertise in ways that best create the best outcomes for their community. I also believe that we should push the idea of grounded theory or research findings driven by what we learn on the ground more towards a concept of grounded outcomes. What I mean by this is that we can create more salient social change when we let our community show us what the dissertation should become, rather than us trying to fit their experiences into our experimental models. If as thought leaders we don't centrally benefit and represent the public we serve, then we have missed the purpose and opportunity of our role in society. Thanks.